All right, here we are with the fourth part of the Chapter 10 vocabulary, the Jarrett Chapter 10. This will be our fourth and final video over the vocabulary terms, so let us begin. Number 41, social Darwinism. This is something we have discussed previously. It was a huge part of the Scopes monkey trial. Again, John Scopes, just to refresh your memory, we did discuss this in the last couple of videos, but social Darwinism is a belief that humans, different human races are competing for survival just as plants and animals did, and survival of the fittest. And this hold on. Sorry about that. I am recording this after school, and never mind.
Just a quick reminder.
I'm back, and I'm sure I'll be gone again in a moment. Anyway, as I was saying, Darwinism, the belief that different human races compete for survival just as plants and animals did. This, of course, is at the heart of the Scopes monkey trial. The concept of Darwinism, evolution versus creationism. There we go. And so this is a belief that, again, different humans and races, the different species, different races amongst humans, white, black, blah, 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 competing for survival. And let's take it a step further, that certain races were superior to others. And this kind of goes back to the white man's burden. We've talked about this in previous chapters. I don't want to go into a whole lot of depth and detail on it, but it is important to understand that this is the driving factor behind a number of different things like eugenics and a number of different people in events that are happening in the 20s up through today, is this belief in social Darwinism. Number 42, Sigmund Freud, a well-known neurologist. He is the father of psychoanalysis, and I'm sure you've seen images of Sigmund Freud before and heard people talk about him. We're not going to go into a whole lot of depth or detail on it because, number one, we don't have the time, and number two, I don't really understand all that junk. But a well-known man, the father of the leader of the psychoanalysis field, psychology, and so we'll leave it at that. And if you really want to know more about him, you can look him up on your own. Number 43, Sinclair Lewis, a member of the Lost Generation. The Lost Generation were a group of writers who lived in Paris after World War I ended. They were nicknamed the Lost Generation by one of their own, and they were trying to find meaning in the world after the war, after the 20+ million dead and the millions and millions of men and women who've been wounded in the hundreds of billions, maybe even trillions of dollars of damage. They sought to find some form of rational explanation for what they did or what they saw. And so they were referred to as the Lost Generation. Sinclair Lewis was one of them. His books were innovative, and they were innovative because they featured modern working women, and these modern working women were very strong characters, something that had not really happened a great deal before, where you have strong women playing important roles within literature. F. Scott Fitzgerald, another member of the Lost Generation, wrote The Great Gatsby. And of course, The Great Gatsby, some of you have probably read the book. There have been a couple of versions of the book made into a movie. The most recent one with Leonardo DiCaprio came out 4 or 5 years ago, I guess. Anyway, the book Gatsby was about the idle rich, if you will. And there's a lot of people, particularly within the Lost Generation, who believe that the rich were rich because all they did was sit on their butts and people gave them money, or they inherited their money. Now, in some cases that may be true, but the rich do not get rich, the rich do not stay rich without some kind of effort. Anyway, Gatsby was one of these idle rich, and he would spend the winter here and the summer there, and all he essentially did was be seen and have parties, kind of like Paris Hilton. Okay, Paris Hilton is essentially today's Gatsby, if you will. If you've never seen the book or the movies, I'm not going to spoil the plot for you. It's actually pretty good stuff. I find that to be one of the better books from this era. And so if you have time, it wouldn't hurt you to read it. In addition, he wrote the Jazz Age, Harlem, number 45. Predominantly black area of New York. We have discussed this several times, and it, of course, was the birthplace of the Harlem Renaissance. We talked about in the previous video. Harlem Renaissance was the center of the African American, the black explosion of art, music, literature, poetry, sculpting, dance, you name it. Harlem was at the heart of it, and the Harlem Renaissance is how we refer to it. Places like the Cotton Club, which I know I have mentioned to you previously. The Cotton Club was a nightclub in New York where you could go listen to, watch black performers sing, dance, play music, primarily a white audience, predominantly a white audience, predominantly black entertainers. And it was the white audience that gave credibility to and economic credibility to these black performers. It was the white audience who paid for this music, this art. And let's take it a step further. When you look at a painting, when you read a book, you don't know what the color is of the person who wrote it. You don't even know the gender necessarily. Now, when you hear music, when you hear someone sing, watch them dance. Yeah, okay, maybe when you hear someone sing or you watch them dance, yes. But no. And so a lot of people did not know about the Harlem Renaissance. They heard music on the radio or a record player probably at first. They read literature. They saw paintings from these black musicians in Harlem, part of the Harlem Renaissance, and they said, that's good stuff. And when they found that it was a black musician or a black author, oh yeah, still good stuff. And so the Cotton Club was an avenue for musicians to, hold on. As I was saying, the Cotton Club was an avenue for black musicians, black singers, black artists, dancers, whatever the case may be, to show their abilities to the white audience that then spread that music, that stories of the dance, whatever the case may be, to other venues which allowed them to gain in notoriety, fame, and in money. All right, let's continue and go to the next slide. Number 46, the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age is a period of time, also commonly referred to as the Roaring Twenties. They are often used interchangeably. The 1920s is also the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. Now, of course, jazz is a form of music, predominantly black, and it is upbeat, it is happy, it is entertaining. The blues, which is also a predominantly black musical genre, is the opposite. It is sad, it is slow, it is melancholy. And so the 20s were roaring. The 20s were the Jazz Age, from flappers to motion pictures to modern sports to organized crime. That was the Jazz Age. Number 47, Alan Locke, poet during the Harlem Renaissance. He was obviously black, African American. His work, his poetry, expressed a new pride in black heritage and attacked racism. Now, we have seen sort of an outgrowth of some of this recently. There are those who would have you believe or would tell you that the Black Lives Matter movement over the course of the last couple of years is about pride in black heritage while attacking racism. Now, I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but what we've seen recently in our own experiences on college campuses and elsewhere is an outgrowth of anger, animosity into the Black Lives Matter movement. Just like we saw in the Harlem Renaissance, a lot of what was going on was pent-up anger, frustration at whites for the mistreatment, the racism aimed at them, aimed at blacks by whites, and they were able to positively to aim their frustration, take their anger and frustration, and use it in a positive manner, which of course we refer to as the Harlem Renaissance, through music, through writing, poetry by Alan Locke, for example, sculpture, dance. African Americans were able to express themselves in a manner that not only got the point across, but also was somewhat lucrative. So they were able to express that pride in black heritage. They were able to attack racism in a manner that was acceptable, and this is kind of important in a way, was acceptable to whites. Again, the bulk of the money in the country was controlled by whites, not blacks. And so if you're going to be financially successful, you need the support of white patrons. You need white money, if you want to use that phrase. And so you had to make your music, your literature, your dance, whatever it is, as part of the Harlem Renaissance, you had to make it acceptable to a certain extent. You had to make it financially, as an actor, I mean, you know, you got to eat, right? I mean, if you're a musician, you still got to eat. You got to buy toilet paper and all that other junk. So you had to make money, and the best way to do that was to become successful within the white community. Today's Black Lives Matter appears really more about, and again, this is probably out of place with this, but there are some similarities between the two. It seems more about anger and not expressing it in a positive way or a way to illustrate it, but to continue the anger. Now, whether this will eventually grow into something positive, the Black Lives Matter, or not, I have no idea. But I do see some similarities in the growth of black literature, black music, expressing anger, animosity. The blues is about being angry, about loss, about sadness. And they were able to express that sadness, that loss, that mistreatment at the hands of whites in music. Anyway, we'll see if that works out. But let's move forward. Number 48, County Cullen. I am probably mispronouncing that, and I apologize. But here we have another poet, just like we had with Locke right there. Another poet during the Harlem Renaissance who won more major literary prizes than any other African-American writer in the 1920s, okay? And there were a number of good writers, black writers, who came to gain some national and international fame. And here we have the most celebrated in terms of award-winning. Of course, doesn't mean that they're the best, but they did win more awards than anyone else. So therefore, they must have some talent. The most award-winning of the African American writers of the 20s. So again, that is saying a great deal. Number 49, Zora Neale Hurston, one of the first successful African American female authors. So, I mean, we're looking at here with Locke, Cullen, Hurston, several of the writers, poets, authors. Writers, whether they're writing poetry or fiction or nonfiction is not really relevant. We're seeing a growth of African American authors, literature during the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, and this is a huge part of the 1920s. And we, America, have been greatly influenced by black artists, musicians, actors, athletes from that point to today. In fact, the type of music most of you listen to, hip-hop or rap or whatever we call it these days, the majority of you listen to music that is performed by black musicians. And there are any number of black actors. who we watch and admire their talents on the screen daily. Athletes, pretty much every major sport, the dominant athletes of that sport, football, basketball in particular, two major sports in America, two most popular sports in America, are dominated by black athletes. So the Harlem Renaissance is the beginning of that movement to open white America to the talents of black America. Number 50, the Back to Africa movement. This, of course, was started by Marcus Garvey. We discussed this a little bit earlier. Mr. Garvey was a scam artist, sadly, but he was. And what he attempted to do was to start a steam shipping company, a company of steamships, which he called the Black Star. And he was going to raise money to return blacks to Africa. But, of course, he never was successful because, I mean, let's face it, many of the African Americans in America had been here for generations. They were no more African than I am. So, just to say that, oh, we're going to take all blacks back to Africa, it's kind of ridiculous. And it's like taking me back to England or Germany. My ancestors are English and German. And you take me and drop me in London, I have no idea where I am or what I'm doing because I am not English. Yet my ancestors came from there, as they did from Germany. And we just pick an athlete. Oh my gosh. It doesn't really matter. Pick any black athlete or actor or musician or poet or whatever today who is African American. Take them back to Africa and drop them there. They don't know the culture. They don't know the languages. It is ridiculous. And this was fueled partially by, let's face it, Mr. Garvey's greed. He was always kind of a hustler. But there's also some racism here. Some people did donate to this. Hey, let's get all the blacks out of America. And that kind of goes back to this concept of nativism, racism of the Klan that we have been discussing off and on throughout this chapter. Okay. Let us move on to our last slide. And we're going to be looking at the Republican policies that favored business. As I told you in the very first video, the first slide or two, the Republican Party dominated politics in the 1920s. The three presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, are all Republicans. They're all believers in laissez-faire economics. We'll talk a little bit about those more as we go. And I believe the majority of the 1920s was also dominated in Congress by the Republican Party. And so we're going to look at a couple of the beliefs of the Republican Party. Now, there's a couple of statements here that I don't necessarily agree with, and I'll tell you what is mentioned in the statement, and I'll tell you where I disagree with them. But let's take a quick look at them, and this will finish up our presentation for the fourth video. Number one, high protective tariffs. The Republican Party was the party of business at that time. The majority of elected officials from the New England Great Lakes area, where the majority of industry was found, were Republicans. And so tariffs, taxes on imported goods, was the method in which the government attempted to protect U.S. manufacturers from foreign-made goods. It states here, Congress passed tariffs, and again, tariffs are these taxes that would protect U.S. manufacturers by keeping out foreign-made goods. Use an example today, American-made cars versus Japanese-made cars. The Japanese have developed a method which allows them to build cars under the cost of American-made cars. And so we place tariffs on them to raise the cost of the Japanese car to roughly the same as the American-made car. All things being equal, people tend to buy American. However, if those tariffs are not in place, people would buy the less expensive car, particularly we're talking about a couple $1,000s in difference, which would then cost Americans jobs and probably cost American industries to close. The Hawley-Smoot tariff, which was passed in 1930, raised tariffs to the highest levels ever in history. Now, this is significant for a couple of reasons. This is after the stock market crash of 1929. Keep in mind the Hawley-Smoot tariff was in 1930. Herbert Hoover, who was now President of the United States, was advised by his people, his advisors, that you got to raise tariffs that would then keep American prices of those American-made. I'm sorry, I got kicked off there for a second. Let me repeat that. The Hawley-Smoot tariff would raise tariffs of imported goods to such a level that people would have to buy American, or people would more than likely buy American, which would then create American jobs. Again, in theory, not a bad idea, but the problem is we also sold a great deal of our goods overseas. And when we, the United States, raised tariffs on foreign-made goods, and again, what we're talking about foreign-made goods. When we raised the tariffs on those foreign-made goods, they stopped buying our goods, which meant that we were not selling as many goods. Again, you could use any good. Cars, paint brushes, bicycles. I mean, it doesn't really matter which one. The concept holds true. And so by raising tariffs on their goods coming to our nation, they retaliated by raising tariffs on our goods, which means they weren't buying as much, as buying as many American goods, which means Americans lost jobs. When there is an economic slowdown, when there is a recession, and at the moment in 1930 we're in a recession, the last thing you want to do in an economic slowdown is raise tariffs. You don't want to raise taxes. It is a stupid idea. You want to cut taxes. And yet, what did Hoover do? He raised taxes. Let's move on to the second point here. Lower taxes on the wealthy and corporations. Okay. Oftentimes, that is a situation that we find ourselves in when there is an economic slowdown. We do not raise taxes. Tariffs are taxes. You don't raise them. You cut them. And by definition, the wealthy have a lot of money, and therefore you want to make sure they keep their money, and you want to make sure that they spend their money. So you lower taxes on them, which means they get to keep a little bit more. The idea behind it, and this is referred to as supply-side economics, and we'll take this up in the next chapter in greater depth, but Congress, and let's go back to what they did. Congress slashed taxes on the rich. Now again, the definition of rich can vary. We're not going to go into all of that at this moment, but they cut taxes, and we're probably referring to primarily income tax. Keep in mind the income tax, which was the 16th Amendment, was started in 1913. We're now in 1930, so for 17 years we've been collecting taxes on pretty much everyone who works. And I do have a chart somewhere, I don't have it in front of me at this moment, that shows the tax rates from 1913 all the way up to the present, and I'll probably try to break that out, and we'll take a look at it when we get to the next chapter. But anyway, taxes were cut on the rich and corporations. The idea was if they had more money, they would then spend that money by hiring more people, by expanding their business, so forth and so on. According to the book, as a result, or at least according to the person who wrote this, a larger tax burden was shifted to the average wage earner. Now again, this is the part I have a little bit of a problem with. When history has shown us when you cut taxes, you tend to raise revenue. People who have their taxes cut tend to spend that money, which leads to the creation of jobs. And we'll talk about this in great depth and detail in the next chapter, as we've discussed the Great Depression and the economic policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. But for right now, we'll leave this as it is, and for any test or quizzes, this is the material that you need to be aware of. But we will break it down, and we will go into great detail about this concept right there and how I believe it to be false. But we're going to leave it alone for right now. We're going to move on to our last one, because we have been at this about 24 minutes. I want to finish this up in the next minute or so. Lax enforcement of antitrust laws and regulations. Yeah, this is true. This is laissez-faire. Okay? I've given you the example of the boxers in the boxing match. The boxers being the employee and employee, or producer and consumer. The referee is the government. It is the referee's job to ensure that both boxers follow the rules. If they do not, then it's the referee's job to stop the unfair practice, the unfair act by one boxer, maybe punish them, maybe penalize them. Same thing with the government. It's the government's job to ensure that the producers and consumers, or the employer and employee, depending on which situation we're discussing, that the producer and consumer have a fair deal, going back to the concept under Teddy Roosevelt, a fair deal, a straight deal, okay? So what was happening under laissez-faire is that the government was not doing its job. It was not enforcing laws in place. The government was, under these three Republican presidents, they were lax in regulating businesses, ensuring that the businesses followed the rules that were in place. The business were given a much freer hand, and a large number of business mergers took place. Now again, that necessarily is not a bad thing. Businesses merging is not always a bad thing. However, when they lead to the creation of monopolies, that is a bad thing. And that is what some of these antitrust laws, that's why they were passed, to break up trust, to ensure that monopolies are not being formed. Monopolies are bad because they kill competition. They are bad for you and I as consumers because we lack that competition to choose from. We lack the ability to choose the best product at the best price because there's only one product, one company making one product. And again, I've given you an example of burgers. If there's only one hamburger joint in town, they can charge pretty much whatever they want because there is no competition. So laissez-faire is not a good idea because, again, we are trusting businesses then to play by the rules, to play fair, but when they're given that free hand and these mergers take place, and again, this is all happened in the 1920s, a lot of that was done with the desire to make money and they were not being controlled, they were not being watched by the government, which is their job, going back to the boxing analogy. Okay, we are done with this video. We have taken a long look at the chapter 10. I'll wait for my drawing mode to kick in. There it goes. We have spent a large amount of time, 4 videos, looking at the chapter 10 vocabulary. And hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you ask me. Okay, we are done. Bye.